Well, I'd say that the historical and social reality is more complex than this common view allows for. Fascism, in truth, inherited and intensified the reservations of many classical liberals vis-à-vis democracy, especially a mass democracy. Fascism is usually presented as a fierce enemy of what is termed liberal democracy. This concept mostly implies a very harmonious relationship between liberalism and democracy, almost an identity between these two components. It is assumed that democracy is by necessity liberal, and liberalism is by its very nature democratic. After all, liberalism is all about the so-called open society. It promotes pluralism, political liberty, tolerance, dialogue, and so on and so forth. And all of these things, of course, are deeply anti-fascist, right? Historically, however, this is a very problematic notion. Classical liberalism, as it emerged during the 17th century and then continued to develop in the course of the 19th century, actually contained a strong exclusionary and anti-democratic tendency. It didn't simply extend political freedoms, but it also set firm limits to political action, particularly to democratic action. And in reality, classical liberals were never particularly keen about democracy, which they found deeply troubling. This liberal anxiety concerning democracy, of course, is not totally ignored by scholars, but they usually construe this anxiety along religious, cultural, and political lines in a way which tends to flatter the liberal position, make it appear very convincing in its critique of democracy. As liberal thinkers such as Tocqueville or Arendt, among many others, cautioned, democracy opens up the danger of the so-called tyranny of the majority. Exploiting the power it gains by democracy, a religious, ethnic, or cultural majority can suppress religious or political minorities, deny them their basic rights, and in view of this danger, liberalism emerges less as a companion of democracy and more as the responsible adult custodian of democracy. Conversely, the people, the voters, are understood as the perennial minors. They are not sufficiently educated, sufficiently impartial, or even rational to manage the affairs of the nation. This is the common view of the people as a mass: illiterate, sentimental, brutal, prone to be swayed by demagogues. The responsible adult is thus more or less an elite, a small group whose responsibility is to make sure that democracy stays liberal rather than degenerates into demagoguery and populism. And this is a view that at first, as I said, seems very compelling, maybe even unassailable. But when we look at things a little more closely, and especially when we consider the tensions between political and economic liberalism, many shortcomings come into our view. What this account usually obscures is the anti-democratic interest of the liberal elite itself. This interest was explicitly that of protecting its wealth and ensuring that their property is not trespassed against by either the king from above or the demos that are without property from below. So the political freedom we often associate with liberalism should be complemented with the realization that liberalism also set strict limits to politics. It defined politics in a way which was very narrow and disabling, one can say. This is evident already in the theories of a thinker that was central to classical liberalism, namely John Locke. Locke was a very wealthy person, and his political theory was premised on the sanctity of private property. It strongly denounced any attempt to tax the wealthy and even justified their violent resistance in case this cannot be prevented otherwise. So we can say that a dictatorial option was built into liberal theory. It was not democratic and in fact had a very strong authoritarian, almost martial dimension. Locke, writing about the vast majority of the people, all the day laborers and tradesmen, the spinsters and dairymaids, claimed that all of these people should be strictly disciplined. Hearing plain commands is the sure and only course to bring them to obedience and practice. The greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. Believe and obey. These are two tenets which came, after all, more than 2 centuries later, to be part of the most well-known slogans of Italian fascism. Credere, obbedire, combattere. Believe, obey, fight. This meant that liberals were mostly opposed to expanding democratic franchise beyond the fairly limited circles of property owners. So that in Europe, democracy actually expanded throughout the 19th century, mostly in opposition to liberalism, especially after the big bourgeoisie obtained the right to vote following the French Revolution of 1789. And this hesitation is evident already in the course of the French Revolution. Abbé Sieyès wrote the famous revolutionary pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? He started out by creating a distinction between the third estate, the vast majority of the people, and the tiny aristocratic elite that parasitically enjoys unearned privileges, which again seems very open, seems very inclusive, but Sieyès then starts to dilute the political implications, and he creates a distinction between well-off citizens, which are to enjoy all the political rights, and poor citizens, which will be passive citizens without the full gamut of rights, especially voting rights. So this is an opposition to pure democracy in which the majority of the poor can effectively mobilize against the affluent minority, and it's an opposition that remains a staple of fascism as well. Here, it's important to bear in mind that liberalism wasn't uniform, it wasn't monolithic. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, certain streams within liberalism indeed embraced a more democratic orientation, and they took distance from this inflexible defense of property rights at all costs, which was the pillar of classical liberalism. And this was a new liberalism, as it was indeed called in Britain, but similar developments took place elsewhere in Europe as well as in the United States of America. And this liberalism was centered on political rights and recognized the legitimacy of mass democracy, even when it implied significant redistribution of wealth. In many cases, it drifted rather close to the reformist variants of social democracy. This is what I refer to in the book as the liberal split. Some liberals remained committed to the economic side. Others chose political liberalism. And this split is very important in order to understand the fascist attitudes to liberalism. In order to defend the liberal socio-economic order from democracy and also, of course, from revolution, the bourgeoisie was driven to relegate, to one degree or another, political liberalism. Economic liberals were sometimes forced to choose between a dictatorship, which will defend property rights, will defend a class hierarchy, and an unruly democracy. Such dictatorial option was entirely immanent to liberalism. The liberal economy was fighting off the liberal political dimension. This was a somewhat schizophrenic predicament and is best understood not as anti-liberal, but as a form of liberal self-defense, a defense from liberalism itself. Fascists were indeed mostly opposed to liberalism, at least rhetorically so. Yet, paradoxically, their main grievance with liberalism, if we leave aside certain ambiguities and deliberate confusions, was that liberalism was too democratic. Liberalism, according to the fascists, permitted the entry of the masses onto the political arena, or at least liberalism was powerless to prevent such entry. So the liberal order paved the road to socialism, and it represented a milder manifestation of socialism. So in fact, the fascists did not echo the socialist critique of liberalism, as we often hear. In fact, they attacked liberalism itself as proto-socialist. And it is interesting to note that the very principle of progressive taxation was linked by none other than Friedrich Engels to communism. As he said as early as 1845, the principle of taxation is, after all, a purely communist one. And still today, conservatives, who often defend the pristine purity of original liberalism, before its alleged fall and contamination by democracy and by social democracy, denounce every concession in the matters of taxation and so on as communist, or at least socialist. So we can see liberal politicians with social democratic agendas, such as Bernie Sanders in the United States, and indeed even Barack Obama for that matter, caricatured as communists. Fascists fiercely opposed political liberalism, but they, for the most part, did not reject economic liberalism. And in reality, their critique of political liberalism often resonated with classical liberal ideas. A reading of many fascist texts and discourses, which I undertake in my book on Fascism and Liberalism, reveals a surprising and broad use of classically liberal motifs, such as the rejection of mass inertia, a defense of inequality of talent and wealth, an endorsement of free enterprise and economic competition between individuals and states, an elevation of the creative individual above the masses, and so on and so forth. Well, if we address the authoritarian side of liberalism, there are many examples. Besides Locke, who wrote at a very early stage, we can mention many of the towering figures of 19th century European liberalism. People such as Alexis de Tocqueville, Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca in Italy. All of them and others, to a greater or lesser extent, defended class interest and property rights from democracy. And they did so even when this involved supporting tyrannical measures, suppressing liberal freedoms such as the freedom of the press, freedom of association, etc. The fear that uncurbed, uncontrolled democracy will be used by the poor majority against the wealthy minority was at the heart of the discussions of the American, surrounding the American Constitution from the very beginning. In the Federalist Papers, which was a founding document of US history, it has been argued that a pure democracy has ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property. The authors endorse a strong executive, and indeed even a dictatorship is explicitly legitimized as a last-ditch defense of property. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of property. Every man, the least conversant in Roman history, knows how often that republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man under the formidable title of dictator. Another illustrious liberal who supported dictatorship as a measure against democracy when the latter dares to disobey capitalism is the young Walter Bagehot, very soon to become one of England's most influential liberal voices on economic matters and one of her foremost publicists. He was the longtime editor of The Economist. In the first months of 1852, Bagehot was reporting home from France in the immediate aftermath of the Bonapartist coup d'etat. And he delivered a clear message in defense of all aspects of the military dictatorship, from the repression of political opponents to the elimination of the freedom of the press. The first duty of a government is to ensure the security of that industry, which is the condition of social life. It is from this state of things, whether by fair means or foul, that Louis Napoleon has delivered France. The effect was magical. Commerce instantly improved. People began to buy, and consequently to sell. All is fair in love and capitalism. Bagehot very clearly captured the conflict between political and economic liberalism, and he answered unequivocally the question of which of the two is truly substantial. Legislative assemblies, leading articles, essay eloquence, such are good, very good, useful, very useful. Yet they can be done without. We can want them. Not so with all things. The selling of figs, the cobbling of shoes, the manufacturing of nails. These are the essence of life. In other words, capitalism is vital, it's essential, whereas democracy may be good or even very good, but it's dispensable. All the more if it turns against the essence of life, which is selling, which is commerce and profit-making. If we turn to the liberal side of fascism, many fascists advocated economic liberalism and capitalism and discarded democracy. They discarded political liberalism. For example, Mussolini, in an important article that was published some 8 months before the March on Rome, in the fascist organ, which was tellingly titled Gerarchia, Hierarchy, Mussolini expressed a clear preference for capitalism over democracy. The century of anti-democracy commences. Capitalism may have needed democracy in the 19th century. Today, it can do without it. New aristocracies come forward. Now, that it has been demonstrated that the masses cannot be the protagonists of history, only its instruments. And Giovanni Gentile, the court philosopher of Italian fascism, argued that Mussolini was the genuine interpreter of liberalism as I understand it, and as the man of the glorious right who led Italy in the Risorgimento understood it. Hitler, as well, rejected the politically liberal subordination of the economy to democratic mass influence. In a speech he delivered on January 27, 1932, almost exactly a year before he was appointed Chancellor of Germany, he attacked democratic mass rule in a way which is very economically liberal and defended private property by claiming that it justly reflects the natural inequalities between individuals. He then proceeded to provide a textbook formulation of the split between economic and political liberalism, the way democracy increasingly infringes on the economy, hence making necessary a decision either in favor of democracy or in favor of capitalism. It would be madness to go on and say on the economic domain there are inevitable disparities in merit, but not so on the political domain. Therewith must slowly originate a split between the economic and the political conceptions. Analogous to political democracy on the economic terrain is communism. And he insisted that it is impossible to sustain a market economy in a period of democracy. Yes, we need to take into consideration another aspect. Fascism should not be reduced into a pro-capitalist force, pure and simple. And this is because there is nothing pure and simple about capitalism itself. As analyzed by Marx, who was surely the most incisive and most comprehensive and most radical analyst and critic of capitalism, capitalism is an extremely discordant mode of production. It contains vectors running in disparate, sometimes even opposite direction. This is the reason that Marx often referred to capital as the living contradiction, the moving contradiction. And he also fully acknowledged the progressive tendencies of capitalism, which he called, for example, civilizing aspects, such as the socialization of labor, increase in cultural democratization, expansion of needs and mass consumption, and so on and so forth. He also acknowledged the fact that capitalism opens up the possibility, indeed perhaps inevitability, of its self-abolition. And all of these elements were highly distasteful for most fascists. They resented the materialism and hedonism of capitalist societies and obviously were deeply concerned that capitalism might be transcended altogether. And this explains why fascists were opposed to specific attributes and manifestations of capitalism, even as they wished for the system in its totality to endure. It also explains why many fascists considered Marxism and capitalism as somehow related. For José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the Spanish leader of the Falange, to give just one example, both capitalism and Marxism were pernicious and were seen as leading to the same egalitarian, massified and soulless condition. We are anti-Marxist because we are terrified of being an inferior animal in an ant nest. And we are terrified by it because capitalism gives us a hint of such a condition. Capitalism, too, is internationalist and materialist. That is why we want neither the one nor the other. That is why we wish to avert, since we believe in their accuracy, the realization of Marx's prophecies. So we can say that fascism defended capitalism on account of what may be termed its barbaric aspects: competition, war, inequality, and so on. But it strenuously denied its progressive thrust and tried to prevent the sublation of capitalism into a different kind of social order. We have become very used to think about fascism in terms of mass rule. Numerous theorists described fascism and Nazism in terms of mass hysteria even. And it has also become a kind of common sense notion which one can find even in children's books. For instance, in a book about the history of Vienna, the Nazi period is described as the power of the masses. However, in reality, fascism was the culmination of an effort on the part of the upper classes and their middle class allies to subdue mass politics and its broader social, cultural, and economic implications. They associated massification with an array of attributes and developments that were seen as deeply pernicious: democratization, greater equality even between men and women, the emancipation of women, formation of unions, urbanization, social subversion and disobedience, the spread of lurid and sensationalist mass culture, internationalism, pursuit of peace and comfort, etc., etc. The people, the nation, and the race, by contrast, were seen as hierarchically ordered. They were rooted in the soil, they were obedient, respectful of tradition and leadership, they were firmly nationalistic in their allegiances and willing to make sacrifices. Oswald Spengler was one of numerous right-wing intellectuals who expressed acute fear of mass society and the threat it poses to the existence of the folk. The concept of the folk is eliminated through the concept of the fourth estate, the mass, which principally rejects culture with its attendant forms. The mass is the end, the radical nothing. Fascism was all about restoration of hierarchies and creation of new hierarchies. Fascists wanted to shape the masses and turn them into something else: nation, people, folk, race, community, Gemeinschaft, army. This elimination and drilling of the mass, where it becomes something completely different, can be illustrated in many images from Nazi gatherings. You can see how the mass has been replaced by a thoroughly disciplined folk or army. What about individualism, however? Individualism seems to provide us with perhaps the clearest distinctions between fascism and liberalism. Fascism is all about the collective, whereas liberalism defends the value of the individuals, right? In reality, even here the situation is much more complex, and I think it is useful to draw a distinction between two modes of individualism, which are very different and are still in existence and still compete with each other in our own social and political reality. The first I would define as horizontal individualism. And this means that every one of us is an individual. It doesn't matter what we do or who we are individuals by our very nature. and we are therefore entitled to take part in the political process. So this has democratic, egalitarian implications. Because we are all individuals, we have a voice, and it needs to be heard in the public arena. However, there is a very different kind of individualism, which is strictly vertical. And here, not everybody is an individual. Far from it. Being an individual is something extremely rare. It's an attribute that only a very few, an elect group in society can claim to have. And this individualism does not have democratic implications, obviously. On the contrary, it has a strong hierarchical and even authoritarian implications, where the real individuals are the ones on top, whereas the masses, most of us who have no individualism, should be subservient to these individualistic leaders. Let's look, for example, at Charles Maurras, the influential French conservative, who wrote, "How ironical it is. A dog, a donkey, even a blade of grass are all individuals." The mass was also firmly attached to democracy, which was its source of power, whereas the people remained fastened to authoritarianism. Thomas Mann put this into a formula in 1918 when his views were still conservative. The individualistic mass is democratic, the folk is aristocratic. So we see how individualism and the masses are by no means contradictory. Fascism is all about putting great leaders above the masses. And the leaders were, as the fascists understood it, and many conservatives were looking at things, they were the incarnation of individualism. They were raising above the masses. So there was, of course, a clearly authoritarian and disciplinarian character to the relationship between the leader and the mass, which, again, might seem to fly in the face of liberalism perceived as some free and voluntary form of association. But again, economic liberalism contains a strongly disciplinarian and authoritarian relationship between the capitalist and the workers. And it's very instructive, I think, that Hitler himself justified his politics using the notion of industrial discipline. What would become of a factory which does not possess a tight organization, in which every worker comes to work when it suits him, and does only the work which entertains him? Without organization, without coercion, and so without individual sacrifices, it would not function. Life is a continuous renunciation of individual liberty. Liberalism is mostly anti-fascist, but it defines and understands fascism in a way that makes us suspicious and even in some cases outright hostile to the masses, to mass society and to mass politics. This was done already by Hannah Arendt in the 1950s. Eminent European scholars and statesmen had predicted from the early 19th century onward the rise of the mass man and the coming of a mass age. And she highlighted the affinity between democracy and dictatorship, between mob rule and tyranny. But in fact, mass society can be seen as a very high stage of historical evolution. Here we can think about it maybe with the notion of the civilizing process that Norbert Elias, the important sociologist, was describing. It's a process whereby egalitarianism, inclusion are increased, not necessarily anonymity, because as we argued, the mass can be very individualistic. Elitist interpretations of fascism let this distinction between mass and other collective entities collapse. The dream of the emancipated mass was made a taboo, something obscene, a political nightmare. And I think that this is one of the most problematic legacies of liberal historiography. It's a form of anti-fascism that discards the efforts to transcend class society, move beyond capitalism, explore alternatives to capitalism. It's a form of anti-fascism that warns us never to try and form a fundamentally new and egalitarian, horizontal social order. And once this hope is abolished, we are left in a political vacuum. And paradoxically, so-called populist leaders can then exploit it and offer emotional relief, to people suffering from this frustration. So liberalism is mostly a form of anti-fascism that is not only relatively helpless in trying to prevent fascism, it actually facilitates the reemergence of neo-fascism. Well, I have nothing in principle against theories of indoctrination. People who want to explore the way that public opinion is being swayed and manipulated and so on. This is of great relevance in an age of the corporate media. We have channels of disinformation and incitement, the entire post-truth political culture and so on, use of spins, etc. Of course, it's very important to analyze these forces and to try to counter their impact. The problem I see is that is frequently done, as I said, from an elitist perspective that warns against massification. When in fact, what is created by these forces is not the mass, but counter-mass movements that are essentially vertical in character. They promote national chauvinism and a sense of ethnic supremacy facing a constructed other. In one way or another, they stress hierarchy and competition between groups and construe their enemies in terms of immigrants, Muslims, Jews, and so on and so forth. The problem, I believe, is not collectivism as much as fragmentation. And here we need to see how progressive movements like Black Lives Matter or Me Too are very massified in nature, very egalitarian, very horizontal, and that this is something good. There are a lot of theories that try to construe fascism as merely ideological and cultural, and they leave out its social nature, especially its class function in maintaining class society. Some very influential theories actually emphasized the supposedly revolutionary character of fascism. Fascism was neither left nor right, as Israeli historian Zev Sternl famously put it, and in fact, as he argued, it was more to the left, at least in its origins, than to the right. Let's briefly consider nationalism. Nationalism is a critical factor in the scholarly attempt to make fascism appear revolutionary. These historiographic narratives are based on the claim that fascism pursued an alternative revolutionary path, away from a class-based revolution to one based on the nation. So, for example, Roger Griffin, who is a very prolific and interesting scholar, who is something of the doyen of fascist studies in the last 30 years or so, he offered to define fascism in terms of palingenetic, populist, ultranationalism. And for him, the revolutionary nature of fascist nationalism was absolutely critical. But is this completely convincing? Of course, nationalism was very important to fascist politics, but we need to ask, what was fascist nationalism, actually? and who supported it during the historical period that we are discussing. Liberalism and the middle classes were the main supporters of nationalism in a period leading up to fascism. These social classes, social groups wanted to forge a nation and convince the broad masses that they were, say, Italians or Germans, which was by no means self-evident for many people during this epoch. Liberal popular education was centered on this nationalist education and urged the masses to fight and even die for the patria. As historian Christopher Dugan pointed out, national loyalty and the ethic of work were the two main themes of popular education. One school song spoke of how the children would, when adults, rise up as warrior cohorts to fight for the king and die, fair Italy, for thee. This is validated by the theories of the two Italian sociologists of elites, Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, who have played an important role in the evolution of proto-fascist ideology. Both were profoundly bourgeois and middle-class thinkers who expressed fears about mass democracy and the way that socialism is able to gain control of parliaments, raise taxes, and improve workers' conditions. And for them, nationalism was not revolutionary at all. It was the best way to fight against socialism and maintain the power of the ruling classes. This is expressly admitted by Mosca, for instance. It would be hazardous to assert that the middle classes in Europe have had any clear or definite awareness of the great moral obstacle that patriotism offers to the progress of socialism. But it is certain, nevertheless, that, beginning with the early years of the 20th century, a powerful awakening of patriotic feeling was observable in the educated youth of almost all the European countries. As we see, for Mosca, nationalism functioned as the class politics of the bourgeoisie. Another example would be Giovanni Papini, who was an important figure within the Italian cultural avant-garde, who would rally to Mussolini early on and remain a devout fascist to the end of his life. In a 1904 speech, Papini argued as follows: "But socialism, since it is class-conscious and has no sense of history, is, by its origins and its needs, an international, that is to say, an anti-national party. Now, if we, middle-class monarchists, want to maintain our position as the ruling class and leading caste, those who own the property and give the orders, we must follow, above all, a national policy. The bourgeoisie are anti-national because they are insufficiently class-conscious." So I believe that we can't really understand fascist nationalism without understanding what it fought against, which was internationalism. Internationalism, which was the way that the socialist and communist working class organized its own politics. To see how this operates, we can look at a highly popular Nazi propaganda film, Hitler Junge Quecks. At one point, there is a conversation between a disgruntled communist worker and the Nazi officer trying to convince him to abandon communism and join the Nazis. So he asks him, where does he belong? "Where do I belong? With my class comrades. That's where." "You mean the International?" "Of course, the International." "Where were you born?" "Well, in Berlin." "Where is Berlin?" "On the Spree River." "On the Spree, of course, but where is that? In which country?" "Well, in Germany, naturally." "In Germany, exactly. In our Germany. You think about that." And that's clearly the point where the workers starts to understand the error of his ways, and he essentially emotionally joins the nationalist camp. Of course, if it were an anti-Nazi film, the worker could have gone on and asked, but where is Germany? In Europe, right? And where is Europe in the world? But then the conclusion would have been completely different. One of the most useful and concise definition of the class nature of nationalism was given by Thomas Mann when he was no longer a conservative thinker. And then he proposed to define nationalism in the following way. With these forces, I mean all that which stands against the great principle of socialism and that can be summarized under the name of nationalism. So there's no problem with emphasizing the role of nationalism within fascism as long as we don't use this to obscure the class nature and the social function of nationalism. Yes, some of the most representative figures of the neoliberal tradition often express support for economic liberty coupled with political authoritarianism. So, for example, Ludwig von Mises wrote in 1927, "It cannot be denied that fascism and similar movements aiming at the establishment of dictatorships are full of the best intentions and that their intervention has, for the moment, saved European civilization. The merit that fascism has thereby won for itself will live on eternally in history." And Friedrich von Hayek, who supported Pinochet's regime in Chile, said in an interview, "Sometimes it is necessary for a country to resort to some form of dictatorial power for a period of time. As you will understand, it is possible for a dictator to rule liberally. Likewise, it is possible for a democracy to govern without any liberalism. I personally prefer a liberal dictator to a democratic government without liberalism." Capitalism is essentially anti-democratic in its, if we look at it as an economic structure. It means above all domination, control of the workers. Capitalism is hierarchical, not egalitarian. Elon Musk illustrates the readiness of economic liberals to ignore elected governments and endorse dictatorships and interventions to further their economic aims. For instance, when ridiculing criticism of US involvement in Bolivia with a cavalier statement, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." So-called right-wing populism is often quite neoliberal in its economic preferences. So, for example, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, she's very effusive about Italian identity and so on and so forth, but when it comes to economic policy, she prefers flat taxation over progressive taxation. And the same, basically the same obtains in other countries, whether we are talking about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil or now Netanyahu in Israel is very much in cahoots with the settler lobby, who is now in government planning an extreme neoliberal processes to accompany their judiciary measures, and they even plan to abolish the right to strike, for example. So they are very much anti-labor. No, quite the contrary. To say that there is a tension, indeed a contradiction between political liberalism and economic imperatives, doesn't mean that political liberalism should be discarded, that we should simply uphold a form of economic reductionism or think that political procedures, political freedoms are worthless from a democratic point of view because they are liberal. Sometimes this is a misguided position, I believe, taken by some radicals, when they think that when fascism attacks the rule of law or freedom of the press and so on, attacks the judiciary, this is not worthy for them of a radical response, because after all, it's just liberalism, right? It doesn't concern class inequality, class exploitation, and so on. And since liberal democracy is a sham democracy, anyhow, why defend it? If liberals want to do it, it's their own affair. We should stay out of it and deal with what really matters. I think that, in truth, according to Marx, the very opposite was the case. So-called liberal democracy was seen as betrayed, more often than not, by liberals themselves. And Marx actually saw that the workers have a strong interest in defending it, not because it's the ultimate goal of socialism, of course, but because it is the basis of any further advances. And also because socialism, as Marx and Engels envisioned it, would maintain and increase whatever liberties are currently enjoyed under liberal democracy. So if I get their position rightly, we should aspire to have more, not less freedom of debate and association, more freedom of the press, more transparency in public debate, and so on and so forth. Marx actually provided us with a class analysis that showed, for example, when he discussed the historical events of the 1848 revolution in France, he showed us how it was the bourgeoisie that renounced democracy, that every small measure undertaken to promote democracy was denounced by many among the middle classes as socialist, and so on and so forth. So the proper defense, I would suggest, is to protect some liberal rules, indeed often protect them from the liberals themselves. The difference between a liberal and, say, a Marxist in that regard is not that the liberal defends liberal institutions and the Marxist simply dismisses them. On the contrary, I would say that the radical acts wisely if she defends liberal political freedom even more than the liberal. Notice that with the suppression of political liberalism, the workers and the radicals are among the first to suffer, and they suffer very severely indeed, often more than the liberal middle classes. But she, the radical, defends political liberalism again, not as the goal itself, but as the precondition for a truly democratic society. So I think a socialist in that, from that point of view, would be more consistent as a political liberal, not less. And to some extent, in fact, it could be argued that socialism itself is a child of political liberalism. Marx and Engels started out as political liberals, and I believe they never abandoned the basic ideas of liberalism, freedom and democratic participation for all. They merely developed the concept further because they realized that under capitalism, the prospects for the fulfillment of a genuine democratic project were seriously limited. So the radical challenge is not to abolish capitalist and liberal modernity, but to sublate it in a Hegelian way, to give us more individual freedoms, more liberties, not less. Not to yearn for a more primitive past, but to achieve a progress, this notion which has become so old-fashioned today, empower people both socially and materially.